So, I've been challenged in this whole area of discipleship, radical discipleship from Romans chapter 12. So we're beginning a series of talks on faith for exiles. We are now a minority. We've been for quite a while as Christians a minority in our country, but we had a significant amount of influence. We are losing that influence. And we are becoming like, you might say, Daniel and his fellow exiles. We are exiles in our own country to a certain extent. So 5 ways for a new generation to follow Jesus in digital Babylon, and I'm going to start with the first one. We're reminded of the song, "Be Still and Know That I Am God." You all know that famous chorus. The Hebrew word translated, "be still," means literally let go of your grip. Let go of your grip on your own understanding. Cease striving at the human level of human effort. Open yourself up to a whole new way of thinking. And that's what this chapter in Romans is all about. Opening ourselves up to a new way of thinking. And whether we are 60, 75, a teenager, in our 20s, doesn't matter. We need to continually be thinking in new ways. Our problem is, I suppose, with the word radical. When there is no distinction in conduct and behaviour between Christians and non-Christians, then our world has a right to wonder if being a Christian actually makes any difference. And that is the challenge we have today. For so many Christians, their lifestyle, their way of living is no different to their neighbours. And we all know the divorce rate amongst Christians is no different to the divorce rate amongst those who are not, etc., etc. So what does it mean to live in a radical distinctiveness? To be a part of what God calls a new humanity. And we know from 2 Corinthians it says we are new creatures. When we come under the Lordship of Christ, we change or should change. So I thought I'd start, since this seems to be a reoccurring theme. I think Alex mentioned this last week, David and Goliath. I thought I would start with David and Goliath as well. This is before I knew Alex was going to do this. So David and Goliath is a chapter from 1 Samuel chapter 17, and it's one of history's most famous battles, isn't it? Because when you talk about David and Goliath, whether you're a Christian or not, most people have heard of David and Goliath. For your information, Goliath was 2.7 metres tall, pretty big. And David was probably no older, they reckon, than 13 to 15 years of age. So a pretty young guy. A pretty young guy taking on a 2.7 metre giant. And Malcolm Gladwell, in his book, David and Goliath, Underdogs, Misfits, and the Art of Battling Giants. It's a great book if you want to read it. He says, well, you know what? You've got the story wrong. Most of our versions of the events of what's taking place in the story of Goliath, he suggests got the wrong angle on it. You see, Goliath was heavy infantry, but David was a slinger. They called them slingers back there. Basically, you had 3 people in your armies when you went out to battle. You had the heavy infantry, the slingers, and the cavalry. And that an army like that was a pretty good army. So we know from from history that slinging, which is what David was really good at, took an extraordinary amount of skill and practice. But in experienced hands, the sling was a devastating weapon. So David basically put a stone in a sling and then wound it up to speed, and at precisely the right moment let it go and sent it on its trajectory. The world record for slinging, so that's hitting a target, is about 430 metres away. Hitting a target, and accurately. So the thing about David and Goliath was, Goliath, as I said, was heavy infantry. David was a slinger. So Goliath had as much chance against David as any Bronze Age warrior had with a sword against an opponent with a .45 automatic pistol. Because that's basically what David had, a pistol in his hand. And as long as he was accurate, there was no way that Goliath was going to win that battle. What could Goliath do? When he came down, he was carrying over 100 pounds of armour. And we know in the story that Saul tried to tell David, well, you need all this armour. Because Saul was expecting David to engage Goliath in the same manner. He was expecting him to take Goliath on in arm-to-arm combat. And if David had done that, would he have won? Probably not. Because if you're a 13 to 15-year-old boy with 100 pounds of armour on it, you're going to not move very far, very fast. But David knew he couldn't win the battle that way. But he knew his skills and his ability lay in another area. So who was the most likely victor in this battle? Not Goliath, David. So who was the real underdog? Goliath. Goliath had the real disadvantage. There's a whole lot of other things they think that they don't know, but they're suggesting. They reckon that Goliath had a medical condition because to get to 2.7 metres tall, I can't pronounce the name, but there's a name for it. And there's two things that point to it. One was his size, and secondly, he had to have a guy carry his shield. Now, when you're a fighter like Goliath, you shouldn't need anyone to carry your shield. You should be able to carry it yourself. But he had to have somebody to carry it. And they reckon that was because he couldn't see very well. And what also suggests that is when he cries out to David, you come at me with your spear. David didn't come with a spear, he had a sling. So anyway, who knows? But the suggestion is that Goliath needed David close at hand to be able to see him, to know what to do, which was why David with his sling was at a huge advantage. The Israeli Minister of Defence, Moshe Dayan, said David fought Goliath not with inferior, but on the contrary, superior weaponry, and his greatness consisted not in his being willing to go out into battle, but in his knowledge of how to exploit a weapon by which a feeble, a young person like himself could seize the advantage and be stronger than his opponent. In so doing, David moved from being underdog to being pretty certain he was going to be the champion. Gets you thinking, doesn't it? Transformed by God. Don't copy the behaviour and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. David was successful because he was willing to think outside the box. Guided by the Spirit of God, David was willing to be different, not to be conformed to the ways of the world. And that is the challenge that we all have to take up. We need to have our thinking transformed. We need to be different to the world around about us for them to take notice. And the only way that can happen is to have our minds transformed. Radical discipleship. So how should we live in order that our faith makes a positive difference in the world? Well, the first thing is we need to go to the tablets. I like this cartoon. I downloaded them from a cloud. We need to go to God's Word, because that's where we'll find it. And we often forget that, I think. Well, I know I do. I tend to think, I tend to go to other places first. But here in chapter 12, Paul gives us some practices, some ways that we should live that will make us radically distinct to those around about us. By being transformed into a new person, by changing the way you think, then you will know what to do, how to live in a way which is pleasing to God. So this morning I thought I'd pick up on 6 transformational practices from this chapter. There are probably more, but these are the 6 that stood out to me. In this world we live in today, practice 1, we need to be humble. We need to practice humility. We live in a world which admires the successful, those who exude confidence. We live in a world where people have a passion for publicity. YouTube, Facebook, it goes on, doesn't it? The goal and aim of many is to have as many followers as possible. Where do we look to find out about living life? Well, we look to those who are successful. Who are those who are successful? Those who have a lot of followers. And for most of us, we know that is not a good indication of whether someone is successful. Paul says in verse 3 of this chapter, don't think you are better than you really are. Be honest in your evaluation of yourselves, measuring yourselves by the faith God has given you. Would you rather, I put this in as an interesting question, would you rather be the wisest person in the world or the humblest? Wisest from the Bible we think of, who do we think of when we think of wise? Solomon, the most humble person. Yeah, Jesus, but before Jesus we think of, yeah, it definitely was. Moses was the one which his comments are made about how humble Moses was. So, who would you rather be? Yeah. Yourself. That's good. Yep. Pride is rebellion against any ruler exercising authority over our self-rule. Humility is willing submission to rightful authority. Do not buy into the world's definitions. Humility is not weakness. It takes great strength to place ourselves from the inside out under the will of another. In other words, to pass control on to someone else requires great strength. But of course we have to be careful who we give control to. The challenge is to give that control to God and allow Him to rule us. Elizabeth Elliot, her husband was one of the 5 martyred missionaries, said, The best way to find out whether you really have a servant's heart is to see what your reaction is when someone treats you like a servant. I thought that was quite good. Practice 2. This is a reaction against false humility. Use your God-given gifts. In His grace, God has given us, this is from verse 6, different gifts for doing certain things well. So if God has given you the ability, and then He lists some of them, this is not an exhaustive list, this is just some. If you have the ability to prophesy, then speak out with as much faith as God has given you. If your gift is serving, serve them well. If a teacher, teach well. If your gift is encouraging, encourage people. If it's giving generously, then give generously. If you have a leadership ability, take that responsibility seriously. And if it's a gift of showing kindness, do it gladly. We need to practice the gifts God has given us. And like I said, our tendency, I think, especially in the church at times, is false humility. Oh no, I don't have any ability in that area, I don't have that gift. But God says He has given you a gift. You've got at least one, and I'm quite sure everyone in here has got several gifts that God has given you, and He wants you to use them. Work hard and serve the Lord enthusiastically. You know what enthusiastic means? With eagerness and energy, to be involved. Get involved. Do those things you like, you enjoy, and which you know are important. Practice 2. Use your God-given gifts. Practice 3, hospitality. When God's people are in need, be ready to help them. Always be eager to practice hospitality. To follow Jesus means to honour those He honours, to bless those He blesses, to serve those He serves. This sounds simple, but when practiced, this is revolutionary. It is counterculture. None of these practices that Paul highlights in this chapter are practices that are difficult. Well, they are and they're not. There's something we can all do. They may be difficult again, I speak they may be difficult in my situation to do it, but they are things we all can do, whether rich or poor, young or old, intelligent or not so intelligent, doesn't make any difference. These are practices we can put in, can do. Hospitality. The ministry of hospitality is something that is central to Christ's teaching. And it is interesting, someone has said it's not merely discipleship, it is also an important part of evangelism. Hospitality, practice 3. Practice 4, live in harmony and peace. Bless those who persecute you. Verse 14. Don't curse them, pray that God will bless them. Be happy with those who are happy, weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with each other. Don't be too proud to enjoy the company of ordinary people, and don't think you know it all. Do what you can do to live in peace with everyone. I'm sure we know the Hebrew word shalom. Completeness, wholeness, health, welfare, safety, soundness, tranquility, prosperity, perfectness, fullness, rest and harmony all come from the word shalom. A truly balanced life which can only come from God. Generally, in our normal state, we should be at peace. Peace is what God wants for you, no matter what is happening in the world around you, and that is something we desperately need today, isn't it? We need people of peace, peacemakers, in a world that is definitely not at peace. And it's interesting, harmony. Harmony is peace or shalom at work in our relationships. Practice 4, live in harmony and peace. Practice 5, be honourable. Never pay back evil with more evil. Do things in such a way that everyone can see you are honourable. If your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals of shame on their heads. Don't let evil conquer you, but conquer evil by doing good. Live an honourable life. The question we need to ask is, will what this behaviour of mine, these words I speak, my interaction with others, truly bring honour to God? Is this bringing honour to God? I think of our Destiny, what's his name? Bishop Tamaki, when he decided to go visit Rotorua and Invercargill at lockdown. Remember that? So I remember that because he was allowed to do what he did. He wasn't actually not doing what he should do, well, what was allowed. But my question is, was it the honourable thing to do? That was really the question. Was his behaviour honourable? Interesting. Practice 6. Be a truly loving person. Don't just pretend to love others, really love them. Hate what is wrong, hold tightly to what is good. Love each other with genuine affection and take delight in honouring each other. Live a life filled with love, following the example of Christ. He loved us and offered himself as a sacrifice for us, a pleasing aroma to God. Practice 6, be a truly loving person. In the world we live in, there is a lot of counterfeit love. We need to show people what genuine love looks like. Our culture cannot distinguish desire from love, which is one of the biggest problems. So we need to demonstrate what true love is. And true love is willing the good of what is loved, if you want a definition. Willing the good of what is loved. And we know from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, that wonderful chapter on love, that it is, and I'm sure you can quote for me, patient, kind, not proud or rude, and so on and so on, not boastful. Well, better go home and read it again, eh? Yes. True love. Be a truly loving person. In the world, in our culture today, people like to take sides, almost opposing sides at times. We have to learn the art as Christians to not be polarised all the time. If we can only enjoy our own tribe of people, then we're no different than the rest of the world. But the love of God's kingdom is much more expansive and inclusive than that. It recognises that we are ultimately all of a single tribe, humanity. God didn't come to seek and save just one side of our tribal polarities. God came for us all. And if we want to represent God's heart in the world, we have to learn to expand our hearts to match the divine intent. That is not easy. So let me finish with a reminder. 6 practices for disciples of Jesus. Humility, number 1. Use the gifts God's given you, and if you're a good slinger, then use that gift to defeat Goliath, because that's what David did.
But not inside your mother's house.
No, not inside your mother's house. Yeah. Make sure you practice in a large open area. Be hospitable. Great gift, hospitality. Live in harmony and peace with all people as much as possible. Be honourable in your life and actions. And be a truly loving person. I'm quite sure that if I put into practice those 6 things, then I could call myself a radical disciple, and people would be able to look at me and say, yeah, there's something different about that person. So, your challenge, go home, read Romans chapter 12, because it's all in there, and then put down those that you need to work on, and I'm sure some of them you are doing well at, but yeah, we can all improve, can't we? 6 practices for radical disciples of Jesus. Let me finish by praying for us. Lord, we thank you for this time of fellowship we've had together. We thank you for your word and what it teaches us. And I pray that you will help each one of us to live out those things that you are calling us to do. Help us to be the people of God, people who practice a form of Christianity that truly represents you, God. Transform our thinking. Transform the way we live, I pray. Amen.